Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the LSE for this online event. My name is Sandy Pepper and I am Professor of Management Practice at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I'm very pleased to welcome Alexandra Palt to the LSE today. Alexandra is Executive Vice President and Chief Responsibility Officer at L'Oreal, the world's #1 cosmetics group, as I'm sure you know, and she's also Executive Vice President of the L'Oreal Foundation. So as we emerge from the global pandemic, businesses are being forced to reevaluate their role. More than ever, businesses are being held accountable for demonstrating purpose and for acting responsibly. Alexandra and I are going to talk about how companies can transform their business models to ensure that they are respecting their environmental boundaries and to try to make sure that they can be part of a solution to the world's most pressing challenges. So the format for this evening, well, it might have been described as a fireside chat if we weren't meeting on Zoom and if it wasn't high summer. So the last thing you want to do is to light a fire. But as we're on Zoom, you don't need to socially distance, you don't need to wear a face mask, and you don't have to have had a lateral flow test in the last 24 hours. Hurrah for Zoom. As usual, there will be a chance for you to put questions to Alexandra. So to submit your questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Questions will be submitted to me and I will pose as many of them as I can to Alexandra at the appropriate time. If you could let us know your name and affiliation, that's very helpful to us, and we're particularly keen to hear from our students and alumni, so please let us know if you are. For those of you who are Twitter users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE COVID-19. This event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to there being no technical difficulties like I had recently when I was pre-recording a lecture and forgot to press the record button. So without any further ado, let's begin. So Alexandra, you originally trained, as I understand it, as a human rights lawyer, and you've subsequently had a fascinating career working for, amongst others, Amnesty International, a membership organisation focusing on corporate social responsibility, the French Equal Opportunities and Anti-Discrimination Commission. You founded your own consulting company at one point, specialising in change management and sustainability, and you joined L'Oreal in 2012 as Chief Sustainability Officer. Now, I know we have a number of LSE and SEMS students on the call, and L'Oreal is, of course, a very important corporate member of the SEMS network. So I'm sure our students and alumni would be fascinated to hear a bit more about your career and how you have sort of managed to navigate these different roles and what's inspired you to make the changes that you have.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. Hello to everybody, and thank you for having me. I'm very happy to join you, even if it is on Zoom and one more video meeting, but it is a pleasure to share in this context. So I'm very, very often people ask me, well, how did you make this this big step from commitment in militant activist organizations and then to the corporate world? And actually, I do think that it is also related to the kind of company L'Oreal is, which is a very committed, a very engaged, a very a company who likes to do the right thing, which makes it easier, and which conducted me to L'Oreal, but also to feel very comfortable at L'Oreal and to have the impression that I can make change here. So I started very early. I was very committed feminist and minority rights defender, and I studied law in order to continue to do so, specializing on human rights law. And over the time, I have worked in a lot of different NGOs, and then I came to France. I'm originally from Austria. And I have worked here in NGOs and in business driven membership networks and for the French administration, also on diversity issues. So indeed, from very different places, but the issue was always the same. It is about positive impact, a lot around equality and diversity. And later on, I added on sustainability and environmental issues, because actually environmental issues are going to be very much human rights issues too. So when we look at the North-South divide, and who are the people who are going to suffer most from climate change, we have, once again, we know that this is a form of climate apartheid, climate change apartheid. We have a lot of issues. So environmental issues are also issues about human suffering, and where I would like to contribute is to have less human suffering in the world, and that is the red that is the element that all my jobs have in common, to do my contribution from the place where I am.
And I know that in 2019, your job title changed, or your role changed. You became, you joined L'Oreal's executive committee, and you became Chief Corporate Responsibility Officer. So could you tell us something about the significance of your new job title, and also what it's like being a member of the executive committee?
Yeah, so I think the important part of it is being a member of the executive committee, because of course, you know, when it's quite easy. If a company wants to be serious about an issue, the issue is at the table of the executive committee, and it is not in the same way at the table of the executive committee if you're not member. You know, a lot of people say, yeah, this is sustainability is not. It's not an add-on, it's part of our strategy, it's at the core, at the heart of what we do. So every company would say that. Well, basically, and for some it's true. So we are not the only company being serious about sustainability, and luckily we are not, because nobody wants to be alone facing climate change. But there is a difference about the seriousness of a company, whether it is at the table of the executive committee or not. Because just coming out of the executive committee, and it is very clear that my contribution is different from my colleagues' contribution. I will have a different perspective on things with my expertise and with my responsibility. And so I think it is extremely important to have this kind of function at the highest level of the company. The title is, I put Corporate Responsibility Officer because I do not just have the sustainable transformation of our activities in my responsibility, but also the contribution of our group, but also of all our brands to society. And that is the reason why we put, and I have also the responsibility for human rights. So it is this large hat under which you can put a lot of different things, which made the corporate responsibility seem to be more relevant or more precise than sustainability.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I've had the opportunity to have a look at L'Oreal's For the Future program, and what looked to me, and I'm no expert in this field, but what looked to me some very challenging targets for your 2030 strategy. I wonder if you might tell us a bit more about that and about the philosophy behind the program.
Yeah, of course. So what is interesting and important, I think, is that so L'Oreal, like a lot of French companies and European companies, is for quite a while committed to sustainability. In 2030, we already took a step ahead, a step more important by creating the first transversal sustainable transformation strategy. And so this strategy ran until 2020, and we have a lot of proof points and successes in this. In this, so for example, we have said we will reduce our carbon emissions in in our industrial operations by 60%. We succeeded to reduce this by 80%, even if our business grew up by 37%. So there were a lot of elements of success where we achieved our targets that we have fixed. But all our targets were, and at that time it was the most ambitious strategy we could put in place in 2030, but it was doing less bad. It was reducing our environmental footprint, saying, okay, we will reduce it by 60%. Okay, we succeeded to do it by 80%. But this is all regarding and related to ourselves. And so when we defined, and when in 2020, we said, okay, now we are going to a new generation of targets. We said, well, actually, it's not good enough to say we will reduce our environmental footprint defined by ourselves. What we have to do now, when we look at the world and where it stands and where environmental issues are, what we need to do now is we need to do what is necessary, what science tells us that we need to do in order to be aligned with planetary boundaries. And that is a huge difference, because now we didn't say we will define reduction targets. No, we said, okay, what do we need to do so that our activity will be within the planetary boundaries? And that means not just a 1.5 degree scenario regarding climate change. It means also biodiversity. It also means water use. It also means resource utilization. And so in these 4 domains, we define targets that will allow us to be aligned with planetary boundaries. And if everybody would be aligned in his or her activity with planetary boundaries, then we would be on the right path for keeping a safe operating space for humanity. So that is what we did now. And so what does that mean? So that means that led to very ambitious targets. For example, in 2025, our direct emissions, so our scope 1 and 2 emissions are already going to be carbon neutral. We are going in 2030, we will have 95% of our ingredients that will be either biosourced or coming from biotech, green chemistry, natural ingredients, and so on. We will have 100% of our plastic usage will come from recycled plastic already in 2025. We will have each and every product will have also in the consumer usage phase, 50% less impact. We will keep our land use flat. So that is a complete transformation of our business model. That is not just sustainability at the heart of our strategy or sustainability and add-on. We are going to completely change. You know, when you have 95% ingredients coming from biotech or green chemistry or vegetable origin and so on, you are completely transforming your model.
So, and that's really interesting that the way that you're saying, you know, a company has got to do more than just have reduction targets. So of course, you know, we've had the G7 meeting in the UK this last weekend, and I'm conscious of various different actors that have responsibilities in the climate change arena. How important are companies in achieving these targets?
Well, you know, we will need everybody. So we cannot, you know, so we will need companies, we will need governments, we will need cities, we will need consumers. There is nobody who can be left out in what we have to achieve in the next years. And so I think that is extremely important. So companies, they are important because companies, they pollute, companies, they have a responsibility, and companies have this incredible advantage of, you know, when we say we will do something, then we have the capacity to do it quite fast and to succeed what we fix, what we define as our target and objectives. And so, yes, I do think, actually, I think that companies in the last year, of course, you still have companies who did not get it and who are not doing the job and who are not serious about this and who need to be encouraged by regulation and others. But then you have a lot of companies who are really, really convinced that this is the way forward, that what they need to do is to respond to this challenge, to make their contribution also for their own business, because we cannot perform if we do not have a safe operating space for humanity, you know. So that is also a question of survival. It's a question of business. It's a question of our future for all. So yes, I do think companies are very important, but I do also think that companies have done and are doing a lot for some of them. The question is how much can be accelerated, and that's valid for all of us. You know, the question is not anymore. There are few people who don't get that now, but the question is how fast are we going to lead the change? And that is going to be very essential when we look to the timeline, to the time that we have left. We know that in 2030 we have to manage to change things, and so this is 9 years, you know, ahead. So that's not so long. And so now the question is on what the issue on which people have to judge companies, governments, regulators is, are we going fast enough? That is the issue. That is going to be the issue.
And do you feel the pull of the consumer in this as well? I mean, are L'Oreal's customers demanding these changes of you?
Yeah, so definitely consumers says very often, consumers all around the world say, we want more sustainability, we want more responsible companies, more sustainable products. We are ready to pay an extra. We are ready to do what it needs. We are looking and searching for sustainable products. Well, the situation is a little bit more complex than just opinion polls, like most social changes have been in the past. So yes, there is a growing consumer demand. Definitely, there is a growing consumer demand for sustainability and responsibility. It varies from in geographic regions, you know, but I have the conviction that the more this is going to be felt, you know, climate change, biodiversity loss, all these are new issues that that creates human experiences. So we have new experiences. We have the loss of the world as we know it. You know, it's like if you have to leave the space as you knew it. That's going to happen to all of us, and that is going to create a lot of additional pressure on people, on psychologically, and then they are going to really change faster behavior. So that is definitely something that is going to come more, even if it's already there.
Yeah, good. So part of the title for our session this evening, Alexandra, was the implications of the COVID pandemic for corporate social responsibility. And we had a brief chat about this the other day. I'd be interested to hear whether you think the pandemic has changed behaviors, changed expectations. Do you think, as far as your job and the implications of the pandemic for L'Oreal, has the last 18 months has sort of been a really significant shift?
So I think what is interesting is that for us, I think, like most people, when the first lockdown started, I thought like, oh my God, what is this going to do to sustainability? Is climate change still going to be an issue? Are people going to be even interested to hear any more about biodiversity, carbon emissions, and so on? Because it was clear that the social crisis would come, that a lot of things would change. And actually, it was the contrary. What happened is that the experience of a systemic world crisis really connected to the threat of what might come in the future, because COVID, when we look at what science tells us about climate change, COVID is going to be a small crisis, And so I think people understand that. And so that is something it is very much about personal experience. There is a second element that I think that people have understood, in the lockdown, there was a lot of reconnection with nature, a different relationship with nature. So people have understood, human beings have understood that they are just an element of nature like other living creatures. And that is also changing their perspective. So I think on a personal and societal level, that has changed a lot. At L'Oreal, what we had the chance is that we have seen that our model of doing the business responsibly and sustainably made us more resilient and was an added value during the crisis. Because as we have always thinking about how can we contribute to society, what happened, so immediately after the lockdown, the day after, we had this whole plan for our employees about how we are going to secure their jobs, how we are going to secure their safety, their health, and so on. Then we developed a plan where we changed our whole production, a lot of our production sites, to produce hand sanitizers that we donated all around the world. We donated more than 50 million units. Then we had a supplier program of how can we support our suppliers, especially the small suppliers, by paying them immediately. You know, normally when you have business, you have like 6 weeks until you are paid. Here we said, okay, for the small suppliers, we will pay immediately so that they do not have any treasury issue. On the contrary, for our small clients, we said, okay, you don't have to pay now, you can pay later, so that they do not have treasury issues either. And with the L'Oreal Foundation, we did an enormous work in going to the field and bringing hand sanitizers, hygiene products, food aid to people who are in vulnerable communities. And so that happened, and that was an incredible source of pride for our employees. We created a volunteer program for our employees, so they were able to give lessons to children that were underprivileged children, so that they did not miss out on school too much. They could call. We worked with community organizations so that they can call older people in order that they are not so low. The loneliness is less. So, and that model, that reaction to what happened, well, first it created, of course, an enormous pride among our employees. We had 10,000 WhatsApp conversations with our suppliers, in order to help them, to accompany them, to keep the whole value chain going. And all this perspective on how we do business and how we see our role in business helped us to go through this crisis and come out very, very strong, and very reassured that our perspective on a sustainable, responsible business model is the one that will prevail in the future.
Good. But one last question from me, Alexandra, if I may. Perhaps a slightly tougher question, maybe. I'm aware of some academics, some journalists, some commentators who question sort of the recent move of some companies into the sort of the focus on corporate purpose and the whole sort of CSR agenda. They unkindly use phrases like greenwashing. And I should stress, not specifically about L'Oreal, but about the corporate sector generally. And I just wonder what you would say to them, what your perspective on that kind of.
Yeah, so I do think that we do not have the luxury to simplify things. We are in a situation, the situation is serious, so it needs serious people and serious responses. And that means that unfortunately you will have to judge and to evaluate and to have an opinion individually on each company and on each actor who says that he's involved. So at L'Oreal, we have proof points, we can showcase how serious our transformation is, how much we invest, how much we do. And of course, our consumers, they ask for purpose, and we are happy because we are happy to do purpose. People, sometimes I have the impression that people think that we get up in the morning, come to our jobs and say, oh, we want to do useless things with no ethics. That's not the way it happens. What happens is that people at L'Oreal, they are great people. They get up in the morning and they want to have a positive contribution. So what I say to people is, yes, of course, greenwashing exists. Of course, and nobody is perfect today. And I think this is very important. If you ask for perfection, then you will always have the proof point that this is not working. Yes, we all live in a system that was created on infinite resources, infinite consumption, infinite waste. And now we are changing that model. So there is not one individual, not one city, not one government, not one company that is perfect. If you ask me if L'Oreal is perfect, I will tell you now, no, we have still a long way to go to get where we want. Are we sincere in what we do? Yes. We all get up in the morning and say, how are we going to lead that change today in our products, in our marketing campaigns, and we are happy that the consumer asks for purpose, because that is what we love to do and what we like to do. And then there are other companies just like as we are. They are committed companies, engaged companies, and once again, that doesn't mean that they are perfect, but the demand for perfection is the most important obstacle to any progress. So I do think that the sincerity is on what we have to be judged. And then unfortunately, there are still companies who think that they can do business as they have done in the last century. And that are the companies on which you will have to which people should have an opinion and an action in order to encourage them to change to. But I definitely think that we do not have in our time, with the responsibilities we have, we cannot have the luxury of saying all companies are bad and all NGOs are good and all governments are this and that. No, we have to have complex evaluation and judgment, I think.
Well said, and your passion comes through in your answers. So thank you. So I'm going to start looking in the chat now, and the first question I see is from one of my colleagues in the management department at the LSE, and he is curious to know what kind of resistance you meet when you're championing sustainability with other stakeholders, so with your colleagues and with your suppliers and other people that the company interacts with.
So I have the impression that there is a before Paris Agreement and a post-Paris Agreement. So I think one of the great achievements and successes of Paris Agreement is very clearly that people somehow, that was a tipping point, you know. People became aware this is not about protecting the planet, this is about the human species and a safe operating space for human species. So I definitely have the impression that since the Paris Agreement, resistance has completely changed its nature. So people are not resistant because they do not believe it, that this is the right thing to do. People are not resistant because they do not acknowledge the urgency. When there is a lot of problems is coming from that we don't know how to do that yet. You know, there are not all the technical solutions. There is not all the available of alternative materials. There is not all, the whole system is not yet completely reprogrammed on a circular economy, on a new way of doing. And of course, we have also geographies where the awareness is less important, you know. When you look into some Asian countries, when you look into there are places in the world where we can talk as much as we want about sustainability, people do not yet connect. So that I would say it is more about that. I have the impression when we ask our suppliers what they like about it, then about us, they say we like that you are so committed to sustainability very often. So it is not the people who are resistant. I think it is, you know, when there is insufficient awareness, which leads to misunderstanding or to not acknowledging the seriousness of the problem, which is most problematic for us.
Okay, thank you. So on a sort of related theme, so this is from an incoming L'Oreal marketing intern. Who's asked an interesting question. So if I understand the question, it's about the balance between using CSR as a source of potentially competitive advantage and the fact that actually for the kind of things that we're talking about to be successful, it's actually a collective problem, a collective issue that we want everybody to participate in. So you want your competitors to take it as seriously as you do. And the question is, you know, is there some kind of trade-off here that you need to think about?
So I do think I completely agree that these issues are issues that should get out of the competitive space. So there are a lot of initiatives and companies, a lot of companies think the same way, you know. Unilever is doing a great job and very often cooperating, as is Natura, as is, you know, there are a lot of companies out there that are seeing things like that. In the same way. So I do think that cooperation between competitors exists more and more on this issue, of course, in a legally defined space, in different forums, industry organizations, and so on. So the only so this is I completely agree, and I think there is awareness, as I said before, that you do not want to be alone facing these issues. You want to be many. You know, when you look at biodiversity loss, when you look at fighting climate change, you want to be as many as possible. And so I do think that you're completely right that the sense of history is even cross-industry cooperation between competitors, if they have the same challenges and issues. So I do think that this is where we are going, yes.
So here's a sort of, again, a related question, I guess, from someone who's doing an LSE online course. And this is about your supply chain. So we're kind of conscious that the boundaries of organizations these days are somewhat fluid. And you will no doubt have companies that you've outsourced to and things to, and other parts of your supply chain that you would want to influence in terms of your policies. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so we have, I think that is also something where French companies are very involved. You might know that French regulation has been very early, very encouraging on this issue, or very also leading on this issue. So L'Oreal has started in 2002 to do social audits and to secure the supply chain regarding human rights violations and so on. Then we have added on, of course, environmental issues. And now what is perhaps the change also of history is that sustainability is becoming discriminating element in the choice of suppliers, in the choice of suppliers. So that is definitely something that we have started 5 years ago to say there are 5 elements on which we evaluate our suppliers, and one is innovation, economy, and so on. And then there is also sustainability, which is one of the 5 pillars of evaluation. And in order to not just make it an element of constraint, we also develop platforms to accompany our suppliers, to explain them how do you report, for example, to the CDP, to carbon disclosure, how do you develop an action plan, how to do science-based targets. There are learning programs, learning expeditions. So there's a lot of things where we try to help our suppliers, especially for those who are smaller, to go into this direction. But for us, this is extremely important because in scope 3, a lot of our of our carbon emissions and our environmental footprint is upstream. And so we will continue to work with our suppliers. We continue to work on value chain. And we have now taken a new commitment. You might be aware of the discussion, but for a long time, everybody fought for minimum wage in the supply chain. Now the question is not so much minimum wage, but living wage. So the question is, what can you do so that in your supply chain, even the employees of your suppliers are not just paid a minimum wage, but a living wage. A living wage is a wage that allows people and their dependents to cover their basic needs. And of course, in some countries, like here in France, minimum wage and living wage is approximately at the same level. But then you have countries where there is like a huge gap. So now we see our responsibility to work with our suppliers so that they will also pay a living wage to their employees around the world. And so this is, of course, also a transformation process and a huge change. But so, yes, we can play a role in transforming our supply chain too.
Good. So here is a question from a student at ASADA Business School in Barcelona, and he is asking, what's the most challenging part of your job?
So I think the most challenging part is, to never lose the person, but that might be in every job, so you will tell me. But that is that you never can lose the big picture. There are so many obstacles, so many difficulties. When you are working on different issues, that you will always have to remind when you are in execution phase. We have defined our targets and so on, and you will always have to get back to the essential, to the big picture, and not get lost in the different obstacles and small elements you see every day, but which seem huge because there are hundreds of obstacles. So I think but I suppose that is in every place and every job where you are, is to have the necessary gravitas to understand what is leadership. How do you continue to bring people to make tough decisions? How do you differentiate between something that is a serious or a non-serious problem? And how do you stay focused, even if everybody tells you? And focused means not losing you in technical details. Sustainability was all about technical details for a long time, for 50 years. And that's one of the reasons why people did not join. Why the ecological movement was for a long time not joined by a mass movement, because that was all technical conversations. And in the end, it's not a technical conversation. It is about what kind of society do we want? And what, if we want that society, what are the choices we have to make? And very often hiding behind technical conversations, scientific conversations, you lose the focal point.
So here's a question from a student at Imperial College, and this is a question about activism. So what role do you think activism has within business? And would you classify L'Oreal as an activist brand?
So I just wrote a book about corporate activism, in France. So I might come from there. So I do think, first of all, I do think that I'm part of the people who think that for democracy, and in order to make us move forward, to encourage us to project ourselves, to envision ourselves by being the best we can be, we need people who criticize us. We need, as a democracy, we need movements that are uncomfortable. And so I do always talk to everybody, because I think they have, I'm sorry, that is the evening colleagues who are going home. So I do think that this is essential, to have critical movement, critical people, activists around us who bring us further. As a brand, I think, yes, as a company, we have to take a stand, but we have to do it in an intelligent form. So our legitimacy is to say, these are our values, this is what we stand for, and this is what we apply everywhere where we operate. And we are ready to be proud of that, and to assume it even if it gets tough, and to stand by it. I do not think that we have a political role in the sense of commentating, I don't know, so, political daily activities or things like that. So I think companies have a role to play about defining their values and stand by them, even when it gets a little bit harsher.
Good, and maybe a sort of related question about animal testing. Is that part of your kind of role and responsibility? Is that? No,
it is not part of my role, because there is no animal testing. No. That is one of the huge urban legends. animal testing is, well, first of all, it is completely forbidden in Europe, as you may be aware, since 2013. Since 1989, L'Oreal did not test any product, a finished product on animals. So this is now 40 years, 30 years ago. So that is a long way. So there are, of course, still issues we have to deal with in some in China, basically, where governments test in order to allow products to get on the Chinese market. But we are working together with the authorities because we have developed alternative methods. And by proposing these alternative methods, we have already achieved success by replacing the government methods by coming to by bringing together with others really progress on this issue. So I do think that this is really important to remind that L'Oreal does not test on animals.
Okay, well, he's given us an opportunity for you to make that clear. Just change direction slightly. I mean, again, sort of one of the issues of the moment, I think, is about working from home, it's broader than your brief, Alexandra. But do you have any views on whether working from home is going to become a sort of a norm for the future around the world, or do we think post-pandemic we'll all go back to sitting in our offices?
Well, I think it's going to be a hybrid model more. So I'm not an expert on anything. A lot is, a little bit of, you might say in a fireside chat, this is allowed to have personal, not very well constructed opinions. I do think at L'Oreal, we are definitely going to encourage to come back to work because part of who we are about what we love at L'Oreal is to be together and to have this creativity and to have this energy. And this is something that is really great about L'Oreal, which makes also that the L'Oreal is throwing the best parties because we like to do that together. So yes, definitely there is going to be more home working. But we are not going to be a company where people work from home and see just occasionally. That's not who we are.
And a sort of related question, and quite an interesting one, is so I guess you work in an area where new ideas are sort of coming up all the time. And do you have ways of making sure that you capture all the ideas that are generated within L'Oreal, from all around all your different locations? How do you capture all the ideas and the enthusiasm that people?
Yeah, so that is something that is very, very embedded in our culture. It's entrepreneurship. So a lot of the success of our sustainability programs come from the initiatives that people take on the ground. We have in all our plants, distribution centers, wherever I go in the world, when I was still traveling, somebody said to me, an engineer, a researcher said, look, I found that, and then it can be, for example, somebody was replacing in packages the protection by just a recycled carton in order to replace any plastic. Or we had somebody in India who used the worms to get a recycling process for the sludge. So everybody there are a lot of initiatives of innovation, of creativity. It's part of the culture that you can do that at L'Oreal and that it will then be generalized, rolled out larger if it is. And I think this is an important part of why employees love to work at L'Oreal, but also, of course, of the success that this is possible. So I do think, but I think then also it is, of course, also personal commitment, and we encourage that people do have also the courage to make to bring new ideas to the table and to defend them. But the most, which is very different, you might say, from sustainability. But one of the story, we just had the appointment of our new CEO, who is Nicolas Hieronymus, And our new CEO is also here for more than 30 years. I can't remember the exact numbers. And you know, in his career, there are some really central moments in his career. And one of the central moments is that he invented, you know, the green fructis bottle of shampoo, you know. And when he came with this extremely green thing to the table and said, I believe in this, this is going to work for this and this reason. And people said, no, you're a crazy guy. And he like perseverates and was convinced and said, and this became the most sold shampoo in the world, you know, and that is L'Oreal, you know. You have an idea, you perseverate, you do it, you think that this is the right thing, you convince people, and then you can go there. And that's why I say that's his entrepreneurship here.
Yeah, great. So there's a question here about sort of back to your supply chain. And this is about child labour, child exploitation. And we might broaden this out into a kind of, you know, a broader question about humanitarian issues rather than sustainability
Human
issues.
rights issues, yes.
Human rights issues. So would you like to comment on your thinking?
Yes, of course. I'm very happy to comment on that, because that is a zero tolerance issue, of course. So first of all, we have a stricter definition of child labor than the International Labor Organization, because we fixed the age at 16 and not 14. So we have social audits as soon as, of course, there is any allegation, or we do proactively social audits in all regions where might be a risk and so on. And if there is any child labor issue, this is a zero tolerance issue, and any supplier or subcontractor of supplier will be immediately out of our supply chain.
Good. Okay, so we've been using the language of corporate responsibility and CSR, and one of our questioners has said, of course, you know, that the terminology that investors increasingly are using is ESG, environmental, social governance, and a related question perhaps is, you know, what role do your investors have in sort of your ESG positioning? So does the language matter? Does ESG mean anything? And how about your investors? I mean, I know you have a sort of slightly unusual, atypical investor group compared with many large companies.
So I do think that this is also one of the changes that is happening since 18 months. I would say there is a new level. You know, the way that investors look on these issues and are interested in this issue came to a new level of maturity. And investors are now demanding much more serious about that issue, have really understood that this you know, these issues can be very, very defining for a corporate future. I do not talk about ESG, you know, it's not aspirational. And a lot of issues around sustainability, we have to make them aspirational to bring people on board, you know. So it says, of course, the same thing, you know, it is about responsible, environmentally responsible and socially and governance responsibly business. I call it internally and for communication and branding L'Oreal for the future, because, you know, when our employees say, I'm working for L'Oreal for the future, or this is a L'Oreal for the future issue, that gives them another sense of what they're doing than if they say, I work for ESG issues, you know. So I do think that, but the idea behind, of course, is the same. It is about responsible business. And then I think, yeah, I do think what I suppose you mean is less investors than shareholders, I suppose. Yeah. And yes, we still have family shareholders for a huge part, and that is something that helps a lot, of course, because that is about long term. You know, this is about a company that is here for 110 years, that is still going to be here much longer. And I do think that value orientated, long term, leadership and shareholder participation is one of the parts that makes it easier for us to make sometimes, decisions that go in this direction. Then it might be a company that has just hedge funds and other investors that are not related in any way to the future of the company, on the long-term future of the company.
Alexandra, here's a slightly different question again. So this is back to sort of talking about product development, well, the manufacturing process, I suppose.
Yeah.
And the question is, or posits the situation that you have one way of doing things which is cheap, but maybe not particularly sustainable. You have another way of doing things which is more expensive but better for the environment and leads to higher prices. I mean, is that a fair kind of description of the trade-off for?
No, I think that might be a little bit simple.
Yeah.
Luckily for us, the things are a little bit more complicated. So one is that we all have lived in an economy of waste, wastage, resources. So enormous amount of, I'm sorry, because the office is closing. I'm sorry, the offices are closing, so everybody is asking me if they can leave. Good night. So yes, there is more complexity in this, because of course with energy efficiency, a lot is about efficiency, replacing, circularity. So you gain, yes, on some places you spend more, others you will gain. And so there is a huge amount of things that we can do by changing our way of doing things, and making it more efficient, more respectful, and as we are transforming our whole model, for the moment at least, we succeed both economically and in the sustainability perspective without bringing this to a consumer penalty.
So here's a question, interesting question from someone who works in public administration in an African country, and it's a very simple question. It's so what should they do? What should they focus on? What's the most important thing? If you were putting yourself in the shoes of somebody working in public administration in an African country.
Yeah, well, there are some things, I'm very, very concerned by this question, and I do say with a lot of respect, but there are a lot of issues, that need to be tackled, because there is one issue. There is an issue about climate justice, because what we are going to say to African and Southern countries, well, we have caused this whole climate change issue by emitting an enormous amount of CO2 emissions that have led to a great development for us. But now we ask you to not do so, because if you do so, we will not at all manage climate change and we will all be doomed. So what we ask you now is to do immediately differently and more expensive and more complicated. So there are huge leadership issues. So I do think it is very different if you are one individual, but there are some things that can be done. I think innovation is a huge opportunity to creating an inspirational future. So of course there is something about social inclusion, about as long as people do not eat, they are not going to think about the environment. So there is something that we have, creating opportunities that allow people to adapt to climate change, for example, by creating economic activity, sustainable economic activity. So definitely the population in a lot of African countries are going to be those who suffer most from climate change. So mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies are extremely important. So that can be resilient agriculture, creating new activities, that will bring sustainability. But unfortunately, I think if I was one individual working in public administration, I would think about entrepreneurship, sustainable entrepreneurship.
Yeah, very interesting. So two more questions. This is from Alice, a student at Durham University, and she's asking, is there one strategy or initiative that you could mention that you think has been most impactful in terms of L'Oreal's environmental sustainability?
That is a tough one, because we believe, of course, that a lot of things that we are doing, well, we always have said, you know, and that is not a perfect answer to your question, but we have always said we are not doing pick and choose. We look at all our environmental impacts and we handle them all. That was a choice. So we are not saying, okay, well, because actually if we do that, you know, we are definitely, the beauty industry is not a polluting industry. Our carbon emissions in our production, they are ridiculous, you know. So if we say, if we look just into that, then we wouldn't be necessary to make all these efforts in complete transformation. So that is the reason why we had a very different mindset. We said our ambition is to be a zero impact, or a planetary boundary impact model in 2030 and a net zero in 2050. And we worked from that ambition, and then we changed everything. I think the most impactful thing we did internally was something that doesn't sound like the revolution, is that we said in 2013, we said, okay, every product that is developed has to improve its environmental footprint. And actually that is incremental improvement, that is small steps. But that completely changed the mindset of our employees. That was that idea that our CEO promoted. He said, okay, guys, until now, I asked you to take two parameters into account when you work on a product, the cosmetic performance and the economic performance. And now I ask you on the same level of importance to take into account the third paradigm, which is the responsibility performance. And that changed the mindset, and that brought us where we are now today, in a situation where people do understand what it is about sustainability, what are the levers of change for their core business, but also where the necessary expertise is there to understand the importance of the challenges.
So thank you, Alexandra. So my final question is a very straightforward one. I asked you earlier about which part of your job you find most challenging. And my final question is, what's the part of your job that you enjoy the most, that gives you the biggest buzz?
Yeah, well, there is no easy answer to that question either, because it depends on the phase. You know, I'm here for 9 years, but there were big moments, but I think the most rewarding moment I had in my career is actually I developed with my team very strongly the For Women in Science program in sub-Saharan Africa, because we have this foundation. This program is the foundation to promote women scientists, high-level women scientists around the world, and I developed it for sub-Saharan Africa because there are a lot of needs. And we went to Senegal, where we had the ceremony, celebrating 20 postdocs or thesis students, and women around 30 to 40. And this one woman said to me, and there is always, there's a celebration, and we bring public authorities, ministers, and a lot of media and so on. And there was this one woman from Senegal, which was incredible. And she said to me one thing that was really one of the most rewarding moments in my career. She said, I can never thank you enough for what you have done for me, because you have changed the way the world is looking at me. And I think that was, she brought it exactly to the point of what we wanted to do, to change the way the world is looking at her. So I think that is, for the moment, it is the most rewarding moment that I have.
That's a very nice story on which to conclude. So I'm sorry if we haven't been able to address everybody's questions, but we've covered a lot of ground. Alexandra, I've thoroughly enjoyed our discussion. I've learned a lot.
Thank you very much.
Passion for your job is very evident. So thank you so much, and
Thank you.
good luck. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you for being here. Thank you. Goodbye.